So now we have seen the full contents of Ritual of the Damned, it's time to put the newest miniature for the Dark Angels through his paces. Hello and welcome back to Auspex Tactics, the strategy focused 40k channel, where we're all about getting the most out of our miniatures on the tabletop. Today we'll be doing a focused tactical look at Master Lazarus, commander of the Dark Angels 5th Company, who has crossed the Rubicon Primaris with a brand new miniature. In this review we'll take a look at his datasheet, any obvious combos or synergies on the tabletop, and how I would personally run him in a game of 40k as part of a Dark Angels army. Now in the background, Lazarus is the current master of the Dark Angels 5th Company, taking the command after Company Master Balthazar was slain during the chaos and battles that followed the Great Rift's creation. Since then he has led his company fighting against the Thousand Suns in the Fenris system, and joined the fight in Warzone Stygius, his redoubtable leadership preventing a total rout of Imperial forces on the ice world of Rimonok. There he was laid low by a foul sorceress spell, sustaining such injuries that not even a dreadnought sarcophagus could save him. The Dark Angels apothecaries could tell that the only thing that could give him a chance to live was to cross the Rubicon Primaris and become a fully fledged Primaris Space Marine. Several days later he emerged fully healed to stand once more with his battle brothers as the first Primaris Space Marine in the Dark Angels inner circle. And of course his hatred of sorcery had never been greater. So the Primaris Marines have finally got a toehold in the inner circle. I wonder how pleased Azrael will be about this. I guess we might find out later. For now though, let's see how this powerful company master performs on the battlefield. So Master Lazarus is an HQ choice for Codex Dark Angels. His rules are found in the recent Psychic Awakening book, but oddly enough his points costs are not. He costs 105 points, and if you want an official source then it's currently on the Games Workshop Warhammer community page. I have absolutely no doubt they'll put it in the Psychic Awakening FAQ for Ritual of the Damned when it comes out. A bit of an oversight on Games Workshop's part to be honest, but compared with some of the other things in the books that needed correction, this one's very easy to rectify as it's only having to teach people one number. So what does your 105 point investment get you? Lazarus has a pretty typical Primaris Space Marine captain stat line, with a movement of 6, weapon skill and ballistic skill of 2 up, strength and toughness 4, 6 wounds, 5 attacks, leadership 9 and a 3 up save, of course also protected by his Iron Halo which will give him a 4 up invul. He's armed with a fancy anti-psyker power sword called Enmity's Edge, frag and crack grenades and a bolt pistol. Though from the very cool miniature he has, he's going to struggle to use any of the latter unless he puts his hat on. So Enmity's Edge is a boosted power sword, and it's significantly better than most power swords. It gives him strength +2, AP -4, D3 damage, and if you happen to be fighting against a psyker, you can re-roll the wound roll and re-roll the damage roll. So it's not really too bad a stat line to be honest, particularly when it's in the hands of a Primaris Space Marine, as he'll be getting a mighty 6 attacks on the charge with this thing due to shock assault. My main problem with relic power swords is they often don't tend to be much better than a power fist, so while they are very capable of tangling with elite infantry, they really do fall flat a bit against toughness 7 or 8 vehicles, which Lazarus will be struggling against, wounding on a 5 or 6. Other than obviously psychers, he'll probably be most happy fighting Space Marine intercessors or other 2 wound elite infantry with good saves. On average, Enmity's Edge will kill 3 Primaris intercessors if he's getting that bonus attack with shock assault, so he really is going to carve a merry path through elite infantry. Now psychers aren't exactly everywhere in 40k, but I suspect we'll be seeing a fair few more of them with the new updates for Thousand Suns and Grey Knights. If he did wind up fighting a Thousand Suns Demon Prince with a 4 up invul, he actually comes out with a really decent damage profile. He'll get an average of just over 5 wounds through on that Demon Prince, which is really punching above his weight for a Space Marine captain with a power sword. Obviously, if you do get him in combat with a librarian or a sorcerer, you can be pretty confident that he's just going to flat out murder them. Now he has a few additional special rules. Naturally, as a Space Marine he has Angels of Death, which will be giving him shock assault, which is the most important thing that he benefits from here. Also an extra pip of AP in the Assault Doctrine, though to be honest as Dark Angels I don't often see you moving on from Devastator Doctrine and that juicy +6 inch range. He gets his Rites of Battle as a Space Marine Captain or Dark Angels Master, giving him a 6 inch reroll wands bubble, so he'll pretty much be as good as usual, buffing your Dark Angels shooting units such as Hellblasters or Plasma Cannons for example. One downside though to having reroll wands, as his buffing power is that Dark Angels can often get that same buff exactly the same through Grim Resolve, so he does have a bit of an unfortunate buff overlap with an ability that every unit in the codex gets. The advantage with Lazarus is that you can happily move and shoot all of those units and still access those rerolls, so it's probably better used alongside some of your advancing Dark Angels units that are trotting up the board towards the enemy. Aside from the normal, he also has a couple of his own unique special rules. The first is the Spirit Shield Helm, which activates on friendly Dark Angels units within 6 inches. When a model from one of these units loses a wound due to a mortal wound, that wound is not lost on a 5+ save, so it's basically like a 5+ shrug off against mortal wounds. Furthermore, if it's Lazarus himself that gets afflicted by the mortal wound, he'll ignore it on a 4+, essentially doubling his survivability against mortal wounds. I think that this one is probably best used as defending against Smite, which we might see armies relying on once more with the new updates to Thousand Suns and Grey Knights. Again, this is another reason to want to put him in the vanguard of your force. Smite targets the closest enemy unit, so you really want him buffing those closest units to give them that 5+ chance to ignore the mortal wound. Incidentally, he might have a little bit more protection against snipers with this. A lot of snipers do mortal wounds on 6s, so this gives him a better chance of shrugging off that sort of attack. And of course, if any other army that you're facing happens to generate a lot of mortal wounds, he's only going to help out against those too. I do quite like it they didn't just restrict this to psychic powers only. His second special rule is Intractable Will. This comes into effect whenever Master Lazarus is slain within 1 inch of the enemy, so essentially when he's in close combat. When that happens, he can immediately fight as if it were a fight phase before being removed from play. So he essentially gets Only in Death Does Duty End for free, though it does stipulate that you can't use this ability and then also use Only in Death, so he is only fighting once when he dies at maximum. Only in Death Does Duty End is usually really quite a good use of command points if he ever dies in close combat, so to have that baked into him for free is really quite a nice bonus, and gives you a third reason to throw him up towards the enemy. It's good to know that if he is tangling with something that's significantly out of his league, he will always get the chance to fight against them in close combat if they kill him, and he might have the potential for fighting twice if he charged in, then was killed in return. This one gives you a third incentive to throw him up towards the enemy in my opinion. So overall, Master Lazarus is a boosted Primaris Master model, whose special rules give him a edge in close combat against Psychers, a shrug off save against mortal wounds for nearby units, and he gets to fight one last time if he does die in close combat. This adds up to a Primaris Master who you're going to want to walk up alongside your other Green Wing Dark Angels units, and shield them from mortal wounds while buffing their shooting abilities, before getting mixed up in close combat to use that fancy sword and maybe Intractable Will. So let's take a quick look at any of the buffs and options that we can give him from the Dark Angels Codex. First of all, Lazarus does have a Warlord trait, and as luck would have it, it's the good one. He has Brilliant Strategist, which gives him once a game you can reroll a single failed hit, wound or saving throw if he's alive on the table, and it doesn't necessarily have to be for him. In addition, if your army is battle forged, roll a d6 each time you use a stratagem. On a 5+ you gain a command point. So a little bit of command point farming to hopefully allow you some more powerful options later in the game. Now I would say that this is one of the best Dark Angels Warlord traits. The only question is whether you actually want it on Lazarus as opposed to a different miniature. It's going to be very useful while he is alive, but you're not going to get your value out of Lazarus unless you walk him up to make close combat against the enemy. And in particular, you don't even get to make use of one of his special rules unless the model actually dies. And dying isn't always the best thing for your Warlord. I'd say it's not a bad pick to make him your Warlord, but it probably is going to make you play a bit more cagey with him and not throw him up into the face of the enemy, which is playing at odds with the rest of his special rules. I'd personally say he's not a bad pick, but if you did want this trait, it might well be better to put it on a backfield buffing character rather than Lazarus himself. Of course, there are a lot of Warlord traits that compete with this now, particularly as we have the new Raven and Wing and Deathwing ones from Rich Hill of the Damned. In terms of synergy with other units, Lazarus I think is probably going to be best buffing Dark Angels Green Wing units as they move up into the midfield. I think that for the most part you're best off leaving Raven Wing and Deathwing buffs to the unique characters within those forces, particularly because Deathwing can deep strike and Raven Wing can move very fast, so Lazarus is going to have a hard time keeping up with either. I think that Lazarus has a really good synergy with Aggressors, who will certainly love that mortal wound protection, and with the new doctrine and one of the chaplain listeners, Aggressors can move 5 inches, fire 21 inches, and also count as if they were stationary, so they'd be a very good niche for him to buff, as there are Dark Angels units that are typically going to need to move to get closer to the enemy. I could also see him run alongside Hellblasters in an Impulsor, which will both get him and them up the field very quickly towards the enemy. and then you could maybe get out, use the reroll ones to buff their damage output, and maybe pop Weapons of the Dark Age to have all those Hellblasters damage 3. In terms of character synergy, he'll obviously get some value out of Lieutenant rerolls to buff his damage if you can have one of those about as well. Also, Apothecaries might be able to heal him, and Chaplains could buff his damage output, though to be honest I wouldn't worry too much about getting any extra buffs on Lazarus. He is quite a cheap character model as they go, and is pretty strong just left to his own devices. In terms of stratagems, Honour the Chapter is always one to consider with fighty Space Marine characters, particularly if it makes the difference between ending the life of an enemy character, or perhaps shaving the last couple of wounds off a heavy hitter that he's in combat with. It's expensive, but there usually are decent times when it's absolutely going to make sense to use. I would usually pair this with Only in Death does Duty End, but of course Lazarus gets that baked in for free, which is a very nice advantage. As well as this, he could have the option for Orbital Bombardment if he does happen to be your Warlord. Not always the most efficient, but has the option to throw some mortal wounds around in your opponent's deployment zone. Never Forgive, Never Forget is a 1 command point option to give you exploding 6s when you're fighting Heretic Astartes. Not the most powerful ever, but might give you the absolute best chance of one-shotting that Demon Prince, which with a good roll and his anti-psycho abilities this guy does have the potential to do. If you are doing some sort of mixed force with Space Wolves as well, then the Lion and the Wolf stratagem could also buff his already considerable melee profile, as Strength 7 with 7 attacks is very scary indeed. So how would I field Lazarus on the tabletop? To be honest, I think I kind of have already said that a bit when I was talking about unit synergies. I think that this guy you're going to want to deploy fairly far forward and centrally in your deployment zone. Being a character on foot that wants to make melee combat, the only way to try and force your opponent to commit to that is by marching him straight up the field of battle, alongside some heavy duty units. Those heavy duty units could be things like Aggressors or Dark Angels Intercessors, or perhaps things like Leviathan Dreadnoughts or Vindicators that might also want to be on the move to get those shorter range weapons in range of the enemy army, and Lazarus could be a very decent counter-charge threat while he supports them. If the enemy army is marching out to meet you as well, then Lazarus could be a great counter-charge to them. Obviously he is going to particularly want to try and single out enemy psychers, but he's quite happy fighting most characters and elite infantry as well. Obviously you'll want to bear in mind his mortal wound aversion stratagem against certain opponents. It won't come up every game, but if a significant amount of your opponent's damage output comes from mortal wounds, I'd have a good think about where those mortal wounds are most likely to fall and try and make sure he's buffing those units. I feel like with his built-in Only in Death does Duty End stratagem, there will be a bit of a temptation to suicide charge him into a foe that he can't possibly take on. There might be times when this is appropriate, as having someone with a fighty stat line like Lazarus's fight twice at a really important point in the battle could make a big difference, but if there is a chance of him surviving a few turns more, then obviously you're going to get a lot more out of him by keeping him safe, rather than deliberately charging him into something that there's no way that he could kill. Though obviously, if you do have a choice between him dying to enemy shooting or dying in melee combat, it's certainly best to have him die in melee combat. So how does Lazarus shape up against the competition? I'd say his closest analogues are probably regular Masters and Primaris Masters, and Azrael himself. All of these guys are slow-moving buffing units that could be happily walking up the board alongside your Dark Angels advancing units. If we're trying to get some of the same combat stats out of the regular Masters, I'd be most tempted to put a Power Fist on them, which would have the advantage that you could make it a master-crafted weapon if you were looking to get a lot of punch out of one Space Marine Master. Lazarus is a little bit more expensive than these folks, so it's basically your decision as to whether or not those 3 special rules justify the extra points cost that you could spend other places in your army. I'd say it's a bit of a situational one myself. If you happen to be fighting Psychers, or an enemy that's going to be charging you with elite infantry, he's going to do far better than if you're, say, just against a gun line that isn't spamming out mortal wounds, and he isn't likely to make close combat with. So I think there's some games where his special rules are really going to shine, and others where they're just going to fall a bit flat. I'd honestly say that he's really quite well balanced against these guys. You get a decent amount of extra ability, as per the extra points that you pay. So I would happily have no problem upgrading to Lazarus to help out in certain matchups, but I also wouldn't mind fielding a regular Master and saving the points for use elsewhere if my army list dictated it. Azrael is of course another key competitor to Lazarus, having the notable advantage that he gives you reroll all failed hits, not just ones. This has the advantage of even buffing Dark Angels who are benefiting from Grim Resolve, which Lazarus just doesn't do. Also, Azrael's 4+ invul save rule is generally going to be stronger than the mortal wound protection, as most of the time you're going to be suffering damage from things that aren't mortal wounds, though against some armies that might flip over. Azrael also has a better close combat stat line. I think that, again, the two are fairly well balanced. You do get a lot more utility out of Azrael, but Lazarus is significantly cheaper, so he's a bit of a halfway house between your standard Dark Angels master and the chapter master of the Dark Angels himself. I'm honestly not too sure how many out-and-out competitive lists we'll be seeing Lazarus in, just because when you're trying to squeeze every single point, investing in situational special rules, even if they can be very powerful in certain games, is often not seen great by the most competitive players, who will be after something that can affect every single game. I do think that he is decently powerful though, and certainly remains a strong option for Codex Dark Angels. Let me know your thoughts down in the comments below. I do really like the model, and I can see a lot of people picking him up for their Dark Angels. I think Games Workshop have done a very good job with him. If you'd like to see more content like this, feel free to subscribe to Auspex Tactics. I'm going to try and have a few more Dark Angels videos coming out over the next week or so. I'll certainly be doing a video on Ravenwing Black Knights, which after Vigil of the Damned I can see doing quite well. I do have a Patreon page. If you'd like to give any support to the channel, then of course that is greatly appreciated, as it allows me to focus on this as much more of a full-time thing, rather than just a hobby in weekends and evenings, and of course a big thank you to my patrons who are already signed up. So thanks again for listening, and I'll hope to see you guys next time.